Welcome. You will notice that videos are on for this evening, and I'll chat about that in a moment. But want to start by welcoming you to this special Kingston Writers Fest fundraising dinner and the first event of our pre-festival season. My name is Ira McCauley, and I'm the artistic director for Kingston Writers Fest, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this virtual space. I wanted to thank you for attending tonight's event and for your generous support of the festival. I'd like to briefly acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. I invite each of you to acknowledge the traditional stewards of your part of Turtle Island and that you share with them responsibility for stewardship of the land, its waters, and its biodiversity. I hope that you are enjoying or about to enjoy the delicious and creative dinner catered by Union Kitchen and the chat you're about to experience between Timothy Caulfield, award-winning and best-selling author of The Cure for Everything, Untangling the Twisted Messages About Health, Fitness, and Happiness, The Vaccination Picture, Is Gwyneth Paltrow Wrong About Everything When Celebrity Culture and Science Clash, and now Relax, Dammit, A User's Guide to the Age of Anxiety, with podcaster and fast becoming a KWF festival favorite, Ben Charland. I'll introduce Ben in a moment, but first some housekeeping. So since we cannot gather in person, we have set up our Zoom so that everyone can be seen on screen and enjoy their dinner while Tim and Ben chat. If you would prefer to eat in private, you can simply turn your video off by clicking the option on the bottom left of your screen. You will be muted the whole time, but you can say hi at any point during the chat if you see a friend of yours somewhere that you want to wave to. At the end of the event, there will be a Q&A, and during that portion, if you have a question for Timothy, you can just raise your hand, and we will be monitoring those, and you'll have the opportunity to ask the question then. So once again, I'd like to thank Union Kitchen for providing the meals we are enjoying today, and to thank the Canada Council, Canadian Heritage, Ontario Arts Council, and the City of Kingston and Kingston Arts Council for their ongoing support of the festival. Finally, I also want to thank Novel Idea Books in downtown Kingston, who continue to provide great service to book lovers. They have copies of Timothy's book in store now for curbside pickup and also available for purchase online. And they're easy to find online, just look for Novel Idea Kingston. So the event is 45 minutes long, and as I mentioned, it is followed by a Q&A at the end. So think of your questions and have them ready for that. And now I'm pleased to welcome tonight's interviewer, Ben Charland. Ben is a writer, podcaster, and creative consultant, and I would add an enthusiast endowed with an unrelenting curiosity about everything. Quite fittingly, he hosts a weekly podcast, What on Earth is Going On, a show centered on genuine dialogue with people who think deeply and are keen to consider the big questions. Ben has interviewed some of the best minds out there, including Rosemary Sullivan, Terry O'Reilly, Guy Gabriel Kay, and Sally Armstrong. He's lived in 4 continents and has been lucky to visit over 50 countries. He has appeared also as an interviewer on our live festival stage. Ben is currently based in Whitehorse, Yukon, where he's engaged as ever. So please welcome Ben Charland.
Thank you so much, Era. You always make me sound way more cool than I sound, or than I really am, and so I appreciate that, because I really am cool. And I'm not, but I also am totally jealous of the rest of you who are on this event, who have like a dinner provided by the union in front of them. Like that is pretty outstanding. And hopefully you're relaxed, because we're talking about a book called Relax, Dammit by Timothy Caulfield. It's a fascinating book that gets to the heart of what Timothy does, which is often tackling misinformation, whether that's as a professor at the University of Alberta or with his various books that you mentioned, Era. But also, this is something I read about recently, that Timothy was made a fellow for the Committee of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. Now, here's some of the other members of this organization: Richard Dawkins, E.O. Wilson, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Elizabeth Loftus, Bill Nye, Susan Blackmore, Steven Pinker, and formerly Carl Sagan and Isaac Asimov. Like, come on, this is pretty cool. So I could go on about Timothy's resume for the first 20 minutes, but you probably would rather hear from him. Before we get to that, I just wanted to say that while this book is about relaxing, and I actually found it a relaxing read, I really enjoyed it. I had to think almost on every page about what it was telling me about the world. But I have to say, my wife did not relax, because every 5 minutes I said, hey, it went kind of like this. Did you know that thing that you were talking about the other day? And then she said, yeah, totally wrong. Absolutely full of crap. You don't know anything about the world, and neither do I. So that was our process while I was reading the book. And so she probably hates this book. I'm sorry, Tim, because I've just battered her with information from it. But it was so revealing about these myths and misinformation that we have in our lives, both on the small scale about little things that we don't understand, but also therefore the bigger picture of the big things we might be missing in the world, in our politics, in our reading, in the way we live our lives, which is the framing of this book. I don't want to talk anymore. I'm going to leave it to Tim to chat for about 15 or 20 minutes, and then we're going to have a conversation. Now, I just wanted to remind everybody, at any time, you can ask a question. Just write it in the chat function. If you've got a question for Tim, not a question for me, because again, I'm not cool. But if you've got a question for Tim, write it in the chat. We'll get to it at the end, and we can actually have you raise your hand. And just to make sure, that's digitally raise your hand. So you just go to your name, click on your name, and click the raise hand function. And we'll get to your questions at the end. But without further ado, Tim, take it away.
Well, thanks so much, Ben. Holy cow, you did a great job of introducing my book. That's exactly what I want to do. It really is a book about our daily decisions, big and small, as you highlight. And as many of you may know, the gimmick of the book is it takes place over a typical day. So all the decisions that we make throughout a typical day. And the reason I did that is exactly what Ben highlighted. I wanted to make this relatable. You know, these are all decisions that we all make, and so the science about those decisions, I think, is very interesting. But exactly as Ben said, sort of the grander ambition, and I hope I nudged my way there. The grander ambition is really to use that as an excuse to talk about all the social forces that have an impact on those daily decisions, and also how we see the world, right? So cognitive biases, the fear mongering, a big theme, and of course the infodemic, right, Ben? We live in the infodemic right now, and I like to believe that, I wrote most of the book before the pandemic hit, and so it's very weird to see how all the themes that I talk about in the book have been intensified over the past year. We really are living in an infodemic. The spread of misinformation, I think, is one of the defining characteristics of our time. And we know, you guys, it's freaking us out. We absolutely know that. Here's an interesting study that came out just a couple weeks ago. It found that 96% of Canadians now recognize that they're seeing misinformation, regularly, very often. In fact, that should be 100%, but that, I think, really gives us a sense of where we are. And I think this is important because, I've been following this, Ben, I've been studying this for decades, and it wasn't always like this, right? Now people recognize that misinformation, a defining characteristic of our time. So I hope my book sort of allows people to cut through the noise, to cut through that chaotic information environment. So what I want to do, I don't have a lot of time because I want to talk with you, Ben, and I want to hear from everybody. What I want to do is go through some of those daily decisions, right? The kind of daily decisions that we make, and use them as examples, of the chaotic information environment, as examples of the kinds of forces that are shaping our daily decisions. So let's get to it. I'm just going to use a couple from the book. I don't have a whole bunch of time. As I said, it takes place over a typical day. So let's start in the morning. Let's start in the morning. It is 6:15. It's 6:15 in the morning. And what do most people do at 6? You've already woken up. And what's the very first thing that you do? The very first thing that most people do, you guys, is they look at their phone. 61% of all people, it's the very first thing, they do within minutes of waking up. And in fact, if you're a millennial, it's much higher than that. So very first thing that you do, in fact, 75% of you look at it on the toilet. So think of that the next time you get an email from someone in the morning. You know who you are. And the reason I'm using this example is because this decision really highlights the degree to which we're living in this chaotic information environment. We are bombarded with information from the absolute moment that we wake up. And research also tells us this isn't a good decision, you guys. Your phone shouldn't even be by your bed, by the way. Put it someplace else. It shouldn't even be by your bed. We look at it so often throughout the day. It's ridiculous. I love this stat. You see that 80 times. So, studies have found that people look at their phones hundreds of times during the day, but the average person looks at their phone 80 times a day on vacation, right? That's me for sure, for sure. And we also know from research, and there's a growing body of research, some of it's happened over the past year, by the way. There's been a lot of really interesting research in the context of COVID, but we also know that it stresses us out. We really do. And it's fascinating because research tells us that it stresses us out. That stress makes it more likely that we'll believe misinformation, be influenced by misinformation, and that we'll spread misinformation. So put down your damn phone, okay? All right, so the day is going on, it's moving on. Maybe you've gone to the bathroom, you've had a shower, maybe you've gotten dressed, maybe you stepped on a scale, something else I talk about in the book. Now it's 6:45. This is like my favorite time of the day. What time of it? Time of day for your first cup of coffee. Your first cup of coffee. Now, why am I talking about coffee? Because this decision, I think, is a really good example of how difficult it is to represent science in the popular sphere. So, what does coffee have to do that? Well, you guys have all seen the headlines. Coffee's bad for you. Coffee's good for you. How can we get that conflicting information? And we get it about everything now. We get it about everything. What's going on in the popular press? What's going on? Well, first of all, nutrition research is hard. It's not easy to do. And most of this research is observational in nature. So they're not actually identifying causation, right? These are big cohort studies where they follow people for a long time. And then what they do is they associate one behavior, drinking coffee, with another outcome, cancer, or maybe it's good for you, right? So that results in those headlines. And you see that 19 there? This is a study that found that only 19% of the articles in the popular press actually disclose when it's an observational study, right? So that's very important to remember. Two things. One, remember that, nutrition research is hard. And number two, what kind of study is this? What kind of study is this? And remember that only 19% of the time they'll tell you what kind it is. So that's why, that this is a good reminder to always ask yourself, what kind of research is it? Now, look, I love coffee, you guys. That's the other reason, I got some going right now. And by the way, I'm in Treaty 6 enjoying my cup of coffee, even though it's quite late here in Edmonton. I love coffee. So the other reason that coffee is a good topic for me is it's a good opportunity to talk about confirmation bias, right? So, I love coffee, it's up there. I love my wife. I love my kids. It's in that Venn diagram, okay? That's where it resides in my life. So I really have to watch my confirmation bias. And confirmation bias has been called the mother of all cognitive biases. These are these sort of intellectual shortcuts that we take that shape how we see the world. And the confirmation bias, as you probably know, is our tendency to see stuff and remember stuff that confirms our pre-existing beliefs. So I gotta check my pre-existing beliefs about coffee. But despite that, what does it say? What does the evidence say about coffee? Well, if you look at the body of evidence in an objective manner, for most of us, probably not bad for you and probably good for you. So that's good news. That's good news. And by the way, we're not even talking about just 1 or 2 cups a day. We're talking like 4, 5, 6 cups a day. Okay, so the day is moving on. The day's moving on. This comes to a more controversial. It's 8 o'clock, and if those of you who have kids out there, this is let's say it's not pandemic time. You're making a decision about getting your kids to school. How are they going to get to school? Are you going to drive them to school, or are you going to let them walk to school or bike to school? Well, increasingly, what's happened? parents are driving their kids to school. This is a fascinating trend that has happened over the past few decades, increasingly over the last decade. And I think this is a great topic because it will allow us to explore a couple of cognitive trends, cognitive biases and social trends that really have an impact on our decision making. What is the number one reason why parents drive their kids to school? Well, there actually is quite a bit of research on this, and it is stranger danger. It is fear that their kid is going to get abducted. And I get it. I've got 4 kids. I mean, that's blood to the brain kind of fear, right? What's the reality? The chance of your kid getting abducted or something horrible happening is 1 in 14 million. You can register that as not going to happen, right? Not going to happen, right? But this fear, and I get it, can have an impact on our decisions. The other reason it's such a great example is it shows that conflict between what, trying to do what's best for your kids and what the reality really says. So let's unpack this one a little bit. So on the one hand, we have this fear of that happening, but then on the other hand, so that's the negative. On the other hand, you have all the benefits. You have your kid getting some exercise. You have socialization. You have independence spelled incorrectly. you have fun. The kid's just going to have fun walking to school. So why do we make this decision? Well, first of all, fear. We know that fear has a huge impact on us, and we're all biologically wired to react more strongly to fear. It's called the negativity bias. So that's one reason why this. The other one is the availability bias. So what's that one? That is, look, unfortunately, bad things do happen to kids sometimes, very rarely, maybe in the UK or in Texas or someplace. That's going to be a headline. That's going to be a headline. It's going to be on CNN. It's certainly going to be on Fox News. And you are going to hear about it, right? So that, and you're going to recall it, and it's going to have an impact. If you can recall it more quickly, that's why it's called the availability bias. It's more likely to have an impact on your beliefs. The other big factor, and I'm fascinated by pop culture, is how crime is portrayed in pop culture more broadly. Now, I love crime procedurals. By the way, I'm not talking about HBO quality stuff. I like those old school network crime procedurals. And if you watch CSI, or if you watch Criminal Minds, you would believe there's a predator on every corner. That's how those TV shows portray it. And we know that pop culture has an impact on our perceptions of crime. The reality, you guys probably know this, crime rates are lower now than at almost any time in the last, 50 years, and certainly lower than when you guys were a kid or when I was a kid, walking to school. The last one I'll highlight here is peer pressure. Yes, peer pressure impacts grown-ups too. And that's what's happening here. When your neighbor starts driving their kid to school, and then the other neighbor starts driving their kids to school, that creates a norm. And if you don't drive your kid to school, it's called the cohort effect, right? You feel like you're doing something wrong. Layer on top of that social media, and it can get really problematic. Okay, so let's keep going on here. It's been a busy day. Ben, you've been busy. You've had a lot of meetings. You're up there in Whitehorse. You're doing what you can. You're doing what you can. There's not a lot going on in Whitehorse right now. But you know what? It's 2:00. It's 2:00, and you're feeling like a little parched. You've had some coffee, but you haven't been drinking your water. You haven't been, and all of a sudden there you go. There, Ben's doing it. He's trying to get his 8 glasses of water a day, right? Should he be doing that? That's a myth. I love this one. Because I've been following this forever, and I cannot believe how this myth endures. There's actually no evidence to support the idea that you're supposed to drink a special amount of water per day. When you drink, Ben? You drink when you're thirsty, right? Thank you, evolution. So this one I like because it reminds us to always ask ourselves, really? What's the evidence behind this? And the other reason that people believe this 8 glasses of water a day is because it's part of this massive wellness industry. People are selling bottled water, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry. People are selling, stainless steel water bottles. This is a massive industry. So they want you to think that it's 8 glasses of water. And by the way, they've actually done interesting research that has shown that tap water, for most people, if you do blinded tests, actually tastes better than bottled water, even expensive bottled water. And in most jurisdictions, and yes, I know there are places that this doesn't apply to, But in most jurisdictions, tap water is absolutely safe, and in some cases safer than bottled water. Okay, all right, so the day's going on. And now we're coming to, you've had a busy day at work and it's 5:15, and now you're going to make one of the best decisions of the day. Ben, what are you going to do? You're going to go exercise. That's always a good decision. It's always a good decision. And I don't care if you're flipping tires or doing gardening or going for a walk, just move. And that's the reason I love this decision, is you can't go wrong, and I used to be a little more hardcore about this. Oh, you got to do interval training and you got to lift weights. I've shifted a little bit on this. I think the important thing is just move, do what you love and do it often. But the reason I'm raising this is I can also talk about some cognitive biases. You guys see those numbers up there? Well, this 36% of people exercise less than they think. We're terrible as humans, of recalling how much we eat, how much we exercise, and 36% of people overestimate how much they exercise. And the more in those individuals that don't exercise enough, so they don't meet that daily standard, 61%. So the less you exercise, the more you overestimate how much you exercise. So always remember that. Check your cognitive biases. And when it comes to your kids, it's even worse. This study found that 88%, this was a UBC study, by the way, 88% of Canadian parents think that their kids exercise enough. The reality, only 7% do. So those are powerful examples of how cognitive biases can shape how we see the world. Okay, so you finished your working out. And by the way, the best time to work out during the day, whenever it works for you. There's no magic there either. Okay, all right. So now it's 6:15, and maybe you're making dinner. You got some tunes going. And Ben, what are you doing? You're having a glass of wine. So what am I using this for? This is a good example of what I call the illusion of difference. What do I mean by that? What do I mean? So the illusion of difference is the belief that you think you can tell the difference between things. And you can't. You know where I'm going with this. There's actually a pretty robust body of evidence about this. They have found that most people cannot tell the difference between two expensive wines, right? They've even done studies with people who are experts in this. They've got a master's degree in wine tasting. And they can't even tell the difference between white wine and red wine. Isn't that unbelievable, you guys? Now you might be saying, okay, Tim, I believe you about that, but I can tell the difference between a cheap wine and an expensive wine. Can you? Nope. No, you really can't. That's what this 53% is. This was a study that was done in Edinburgh. And it's actually a pretty big study. I think it was 600 people, and they asked them that simple question. They gave them a cheap wine and an expensive wine. 53% got it right. In other words, flip of a coin. So that's kind of liberating. Buy the wine, the beer, the coffee that you like. Don't let that illusion of difference fool you, or the price. Things like price and music and ambiance and labels that can influence our perception. Now, I'm picking on wine. That's probably not fair, because there was also a really interesting study that did a comparison between expensive pate and dog food, and people couldn't tell the difference. So remember that the next time you're feeding Fido, have a bite, give it a try. Okay, so there's, I could go on and on, you guys. We could talk about, TV binging. There's lots of interesting stuff there. We can talk about going to sleep at night. We can talk about sex. Lots of interesting research out there. But what do we do about all this? What can we do about it? And of course, in the book, I really do talk about how we can cut through the noise. And hopefully this will come up in the discussion, Ben. So I'm just kind of priming you, Ben. So, and the audience. First of all, is awareness, just being aware of all these social forces, being aware of our cognitive biases, that really can have an impact. The other thing, of course, is critical thinking skills. And I just talked about one of them, asking yourself what kind of evidence is being used. And the other thing we can do, and this has been a theme throughout my work, is always kind of rely on those, fall back on those science-informed basics. So for example, with healthy living, we know what a healthy lifestyle looks like, despite the fact that there's this multi-trillion wellness industry out there. We know what a healthy lifestyle looks like. You don't smoke, you exercise, you eat real food, you try to maintain a healthy weight. recognizing that we all come in different shapes and sizes and can be healthy in those shapes and sizes. You know, you take preventative steps. You know, you get vaccinated, you wash your hands, you wear a seatbelt. You get a good night's sleep, and you surround yourself with people you love, and that's about it. You know, that's about it. And the other thing you want to do is, of course, you want to relax, damn it. You want to relax, damn it. And I don't just mean this as a plug for the book. There really is a growing body of evidence that says that if we just step away from the noise, a little bit, we're better at critical thinking, we're less likely to spread misinformation, and we're less likely to be influenced by misinformation. So yes, relax, damn it, and ignore that noise. So I'm going to end there. You know, I'll end with Ben with my favorite two words: go science. And then I want to hear from everyone, and of course, Ben, curious of your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Tim. That was really great, and what a roller coaster ride through not only your book but the course of a day. You know, the decisions that we have to make. This is what you talk about in the very first paragraph of your book, the constant decisions that we have to make. But even before that, in your dedication, you say, for science, hang in there. You know, that there is this bigger question of science being under assault, so to speak. Yeah, fascinating. There was so many things in what you just said that I wanted to respond to. So I'm going to pick just a couple. First of all, you talked about water, which is really interesting. I interviewed Pascal Champagne, who's the director of the Beatty Water Research Center at Queen's University. And this is for the Kingstoners in the audience, which is probably most of you. Kingston has some of the best drinking tap water in the country, if not North America. And this is coming from someone who studies this stuff, who is an expert in water. When I told this to a friend of mine in Kingston who lives in Kingston, he said, yeah, but it still gives you gallstones. You still get gallstones because of, and then he made something up, or he pulled something from something that he'd heard. And when I brought this to Pascal, she said, no, that's not true. And it was amazing to me when I brought this back to him, he was still holding on. He was still holding on to something he'd heard on the radio, in a paper, from a friend, whatever, compared to an absolute expert in the subject matter at hand, and he wouldn't let go. Now, I guess this is my first question for you, Tim. How do we deal on the macro scale, but also on the micro scale, with my friend who still buys bottled water in Kingston? And he's not in the audience, so we can bash him all we like. How do we deal with this both on the micro scale, but also on the macro scale when we're dealing with this toxic diet of misinformation?
Well, you know, it is a great example, and that's a great story. And as you can imagine, I experience that kind of thing all the time. You know, the good news is, and you saw me reaching there because I had to get another sign. Debunking works. It works. You know, it may not feel like it. So, and I think that your description of that reaction that so many people have experienced is one reason why so many people, even sometimes journalists, Ben, they don't believe debunking works, right? Because we've all experienced exactly what you've described. So I always think that we should think of debunking, and a lot of people don't like that phrase, and I kind of get it. It feels unilateral. It feels combative, and I really think that this should be about conversations and listening too. But debunking does work, especially if you measure it on a population level. So they've actually done a lot of really interesting research, and you know, we've done some of this at our institute that shows that if you use the right strategies, you can over time have an impact. You know, it's so rare. You're not going to change, you know, the crazy uncle that sends you the stuff from Facebook. You're not going to change their mind. They're not going to go, now that you mention it, Ben, you're right. That never happens in life, right? But what you can do is you can create this reservoir of skills that over time will have an impact. The other really important thing is that once an idea, whether it's drinking water 8 times a day or avoiding vaccines, once it becomes part of your personal identity, it is much more difficult to change those individuals' minds. Once you've kind of incorporated it into your personal brand, it becomes much more difficult to change their perspective. And unfortunately, that's happening more often. And that's one of the ways that wellness woo is pushed. It's pushed as sort of something that's going to fit someone's brand. So, if carrying a water bottle around and, and doing these kinds of, living this kind of lifestyle is part of who you are, it becomes much more difficult to change people's minds. The water thing is amazing though. It really is that's one of the reasons I love the topic. I know it seems like this little esoteric topic, but I see my students sometimes, they all come in and they have their stainless steel water. It's like they're ready to trek across the Sahara, And I can remember like going outside, I don't even remember drinking water when I was a kid. So I'm sure I did, but it is fascinating how, through marketing and this kind of broader twisting of science, that this has become almost an accepted norm.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I spent a lot of time thinking about this, about why we believe what we believe. Jonathan Haidt, you probably heard of him and read some of his stuff, is very interesting on this subject, talking about why we pick our morals and where they come from. And it's very rarely rational. And often our community, the people we get it from, my mother always told me to drink lots of water. And so that code is in me, and that's going to be hard to unwire. I can read a study about it, but it was my mom's voice in my head telling me, drink a lot of water. The solution to pollution is dilution and all this stuff. Yeah, and I'm even now.
I love that. I'm stealing that from your mom.
There's another thing you brought up earlier too, which is a segue into something I wanted to ask you about. I've spent 10 minutes preparing my own paper, my own paper thing. Backwards.
No, it's good. It's good.
Okay, 200,000. So this blew my mind, and I woke my wife up. So you said 1 in 14 million is the chance of having your child abducted. So my wife is pregnant. We're expecting our own kid in about a month. It's our first kid, so we're totally.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So we're completely freaked out. We don't know what we're doing, but at least we're not naive about how this will change our lives, although we probably are.
You are.
Yeah, I said to her. A friend of ours actually said to us, everything you've heard about being parents is true. Everything, bad and good, it's all true. Anyways, I said to her, when our kid is like 6 and all of the demonic issues that I had when I was a little boy come out in our little boy, and we want to get rid of him, this is how hard it's going to be to do. We're going to have to leave him out, and this is from your book, we're going to have to leave him out on a street corner unattended for 200,000 years. And in Whitehorse, it's probably never. Like, they'll just keep throwing them back to us, right? Anyways, that was fascinating to me, but it brings up a bigger question. As a parent to be, this time next month, I might have a baby in my arms. How do we deal with raising a kid in this environment when there is an insane amount of information, when to unplug your kid in the education system from technology is almost doing them a disservice, where we are living in not only an abundance of information, but an abundance of ideology and polarization in that information. I mean, how do we start? How do I start being a dad when it comes to exactly what your book is dealing with?
Yeah, and as you know, I have a lot of parenting hunks in the book, and it was some of the stuff that I really enjoyed researching and reading and talking to. One of the things, I know there's probably writers out there, and one of the things that I love best about being a writer is talking to these experts and talking about how passionate they are about this stuff. And one of the things I talked about is this 200,000 thing. So a quick aside, I actually had a discussion with my editor about that, leaving that in the book. Is this too grisly? So to be clear, for those of you who haven't read the book, the reason I included that is because people have a hard, difficulty wrapping their heads around risk in statistics. Like saying 1 in 14 million sounds, people don't know what even that means. It's meaningless. It's so rare. It's meaningless because, I've even had a parent say back to me, yeah, well, if you're the one, then it matters, right? So this other statistician developed this example of you'd have to leave your kid on the street for 200,000 years for that kid to have a chance of getting abducted. And I don't know if you remember this, Ben. He said, and even in that case, they would be found and returned. Something like 460,000 years. And it's so grisly, you don't even want to say it out loud if God forbid the worst happens. So it's trying to put put some sense to how rare these kinds of events really are in perspective. But I think you raise a really important point, and in that we live in a world now where social media is the norm, where phones are the norm. And I do think we need to check ourselves and not become technophobes, right? The phone's not going away. Social media is not going away. These disruptive technologies, information technologies, they're not going away. People, when the printing press was first made, this is true. I'm sure you know this. There was concern that people weren't going to be able to handle the information. There was going to be this chaotic information environment from all the pamphlets that were coming out. They were concerned about the radio. They were concerned about comic books. They were concerned about movies. They were concerned about TV. They were concerned. There's doomsday stories and predictions about all these technologies. So I do think we always need to take a beat and focus on the things that the evidence says are really going to be potentially harmful. And so I think as a parent, I try to invite people to do that in the book. You can relax about a lot of the noise and try to focus on the simple strategies that are really going to make a difference. And I think a couple of them are teaching critical thinking skills. And fortunately, schools are starting to do that more and more. In Scandinavia, Ben, they teach it as early as kindergarten, which I love. I love that. We should do that in Canada. So critical thinking skills, but also that simple strategy of having them, look, I can tell I got 4 kids. You're not going to be able to take their phone away, but you can invite them to have these moments where they're not on the phone. And I think that's what I suggest in the book, is really to create these moments of peace for your kids, these moments where they're not being bombarded by the chaotic information environment. So, just those 2 strategies are these steps in the right direction.
Well, and you mentioned this just a moment ago about the source of the material. So an observational study, some people are science literate, but a lot of us, we might have been at some point, but now we've forgotten it. We remember, I learned something about this in school, but I just don't have the time to think about where this study is coming from or what it's really saying, and what the word, for example, linked to or associated with, as opposed to caused. And one thing that I've always found really funny is this discussion, which is a big theme in your book, about correlation versus causation. And I'm remembering a website that was really popular a few years ago. It's probably still out there, where you can see these crazy correlations. For example, one of them was like, whenever a Keanu Reeves film is released, there is a massive decline in duck populations in Zambia.
It's actually deaths. His movies are strongly correlated with deaths in swimming pools. So
okay, right.
So Keanu Reeves movies cause deaths in swimming pools. My favorite, I think one of the most powerful examples is people eating ice cream. Ice cream sales is strongly correlated with shark attacks, right? And maybe people are more tasty when they have ice cream in them, but I think it's summertime and people are in the water, right? It's not ice cream that's causing. So you're right, the correlation thing, just teaching people that there's some scholars, and I don't know if I totally agree with this, but they think the screw up in correlation causation is the #1 cause of belief in pseudoscience. And we're certainly seeing it with vaccines. You have this correlation causation problem. And if you can just teach people this one critical thinking skill, you can have a positive impact on people's perception of the media. By the way, a lot of the media experts that I talked to, they said this was the #1 thing that they thought that media got wrong, is representing studies that are correlation in nature as causative. And one of the reasons, by the way, Ben, is because a lot of these correlation studies, they're fun. They're about coffee, they're about chocolate, they're about wine, and they're about sex, and they're about stuff that makes for a good headline and we're interested in, because a lot of that stuff is hard to study well, to do a clinical trial on that kind of stuff. So the research has also shown that these kinds of studies, these kinds of representations are overrepresented in pop culture, and that they have a real impact on how we see the world. So again, by the way, Ben, I want to be careful here. It's not that these studies are totally useless. They're not, right? They raise questions. And in fact, we first learned about smoking through correlation studies, right? So that smoking, causes cancer. So they do play a role. The problem is when they're overinterpreted.
So as a consumer of this information, if we hear on the radio or read in an article somewhere that this study shows that X is linked to Y, what are we looking for to say, oh, this is something I can, make my life decisions on, whether it's the course of my day or bigger decisions, or wait a minute, this sounds like something that is just more correlational, maybe linked, but may not be causative. What are we, is there a way for us to be science literate enough to imbibe this information and act appropriately? Or is it just better to say, I don't know, I'm going to wait until I read a book that has done the body of evidence of these things? Yeah.
Ah, you came to the magic phrase at the end. It is that body of evidence. It really is, especially when you're talking about something complex like humans. We're complex, our environment's complex. And so it's very, very rare that a single study, and to be honest with you, even a clinical trial is going to be completely definitive, unless it's a really big clinical trial like we saw with the vaccines. Unless it's a really big, robust clinical trial, which are fairly rare, because Ben, those are expensive, right? No one's going to give you $60 million to do a clinical trial on coffee, even though I think that would be totally worth it. No one's gonna pay for that, right? So we get these observational studies. So the bottom line is, always in the back of your mind, have the body of evidence on a particular topic. And always think about those science-informed basics that I refer to at the end of my little presentation. And then always ask yourself, what kind of study is this? Is it an animal study? If so, skeptical. Is it a small study? Think of that first small study about hydroxychloroquine from France that created all the kerfuffle. I mean, that was a tiny study that should not have been given so much attention. So is it a small study? If so, ignore it. Is it a correlation study? Be cautious. And I always say we should, watch the science unfold, go along for that scientific ride, but don't necessarily think any of this is necessarily definitive.
Yeah, it's fascinating and difficult. And I think that a lot of us are impatient and we want to know, what do I do? I mean, my wife and I are good examples of people who want to live well. We want to act according to, for example, reading your book and thinking, oh, this is something we can relax about. This is something we can pay a bit more attention to, for example. And then you get addicted to this, and then you start seeking this out, and then you start turning to Gwyneth Paltrow for advice on how to live your life. And of course, you've written a book all about that. And I think that we get on this kind of this rabbit hole of trying to find all of the information we can, and we feel responsible, especially for our children, let alone for our own health. And I think that to me is why the title of your book is actually so important. Relax, like take a step back and breathe, because this is going to what a lot of Steven Pinker's arguments are about, that the world's actually getting a little bit better over time. We have bumps and hiccups, but overall things are generally improving. And maybe if we relax a little bit, we don't have to panic. And maybe in fact, the panic we have over everyday decisions are what are causing some of the problems that we have. That our anxiety is causing us to lose sleep, which is then in turn cause. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're obviously, I agree with everything you just said. I think you're exactly right. And as you know, in the book, one of the reasons I called it "Relax, Dammit" is because it's a little bit of an ironic title, because I totally get it. In the book I talk about this. I'm a germaphobe. I totally get the parenting anxiety. I overinterpret exercise. I'm an exercise fanatic, so I overinterpret every exercise study that comes out. It's like, a study of 12 people doing push-ups, and I think it's like definitive, just because we're all wired that way. So I think the other thing the book tries to do is really, let yourself give you, a little bit of leeway. You don't have to, and really relax, because often the science isn't definitive, right? This isn't a book about how you're supposed to do it, make every decision. It is supposed to give you a little bit more leeway to allow you to sort of to cut through that noise.
Well, and you mentioned it before. I think critical thinking is so important. That I think critical thinking requires us to take a step back, requires us to observe what is in front of us. Tim,
Ben, if I could just comment on that, because I know we're running out of time. I've talked about this relax, this idea of reflection, and I think it's worth highlighting. There really are studies on this. One of my colleagues, Gordon Pennycook. He's on our big COVID misinformation grant. He's an experimental psychologist, and he has done studies that have found that if you can get just people to pause and reflect just for a moment, they're less likely to believe misinformation and spread misinformation. He's done experiments on this, and other laboratories have replicated it. It's a very robust finding. And that's a scalable thing that we can invite Canadians to do, right? And it's simple, it's straightforward, and it really does work.
There's a fascinating book called Why We Never Think Alone, which is, I don't know if you've heard of it, Tim, but it's essentially about how most of our knowledge is not contained within our brain. It's contained within the brains of others. It's contained within a sort of...
I have heard about this. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a fascinating book but one of the most interesting things that I encountered in reading that book was, if you spend 3 hours on the internet, this is a study that they reference in the book, and I think that they did for the book. If you spend like 3 hours on the internet browsing generally, at the beginning of your browsing, you will say that you're a 6 out of 10, an expert on whatever you want to pick, right? Tire maintenance. By the end of your time on the internet, you'll say you're an 8 out of 10 or a 9 out of 10. On average, people will go up, even if they spent 0 time looking for that specific kind of information, because they simply feel plugged in. They feel like they've been part of the weave and flow of information that we have, which says a lot about social media, but it also says a lot about this need to step back and realize, wait a minute, do I really know more, or am I just thinking that I know more? Which is actually something I wanted to quote from your book, where you say that well, this is a paraphrase, but that we follow a lot of fads and popular advice because it fits with how we think the world works rather than how the world really works, which may be contrary to our desires. Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. And then of course, and there's a growing body of evidence on this too, we have search engines, right? Where, and we've done research on this. So let's say you're interested in the concept of immune boosting, and you go and you Google immune boosting, what you get back on that first page sort of shapes your universe, right? It shapes your universe. And of course it's going to be inaccurate. And we've done research on this. We did actually research on this very topic of immune boosting. And we found that, listen to this, 85.5% of the websites that come back, if you're Googling about immune boosting, are inaccurate. They portray it inaccurately. And only 10% we looked at hundreds of websites, only 10% had any kind of critique of the concept of immune boosting, which is pretty amazing. So that's what people are seeing. But if you spend time looking at those websites, you're going to think you know it, and you think you're an expert, despite the fact that universe has been curated for you for a bunch of reasons. And so, yeah, you're right. We have to be very, very careful about our information environment.
Tim, there's so much more I want to ask you about this, but we have limited time, and I want to pitch it to the audience in just a moment. So again, if any of you have questions for Tim, please write them in the chat. You can also raise your hand. If you do so, Jennifer is going to let me know who raised their hand first. So we're going to have a little bit of a competition to see who can raise their hand first. But we actually have a question here from Nan Hudson in the chat. She says, I haven't had the chance to read your book yet, so forgive me if you do address this. And I think this is I think this came up when we were talking about leaving your kid out on the street for 1,000 years. My question tonight, you were speaking in general terms, but would you really say the same thing to white parents as you would to Black or Indigenous parents or same-sex parents? The pandemic is revealing very real inequities amongst various groups.
No, this is an incredibly important point. And in the book, I do, as you know, I raise this. One of the, I talked about these science-informed basics about living a healthy lifestyle. You know what the most important thing about your health is? Picking your parents, picking your socioeconomic status. That is the most important thing. And I mean that a little bit ironically, but we know that systemic issues are the single most important issue to health, and particularly when you're talking about public health. And in this individual is right. I'm also talking about generalities when you're talking about addressing misinformation and addressing these kinds of beliefs. So important to engage these communities, to co-create messaging with these communities. And we try to do that with a program that we're working on right now called Science Up First. If you're interested in getting credible science-based information, this is in the context of COVID right now, but We hope it lives on after. We're trying to work with all of these communities, in order to create messaging that's relevant to their social circumstances, and really let them lead the messaging. So this is really, really important. And I think that there is a robust body of evidence to talk about that. A lot of it's emanating from the United States, but we have a lot here, obviously, about Indigenous communities. So again, we're trying to work with Indigenous scholars on this exact point. So thank you for raising that.
Well, and this actually goes back to correlation and causation, like you were mentioning. For example, one of the studies you talk about in your book, or the body of evidence about flossing, right? How bad we are at flossing, and how that flossing may be linked to increased dental hygiene, but not because you necessarily floss, but because people who floss more probably just spend more time brushing their teeth, focusing on their teeth, eating well. And I find, and we can also say the same thing about your income, your stability in a social situation, your parents can be linked to so many other outcomes. And the book, this is another theme in your book. This comes up time and time again, that our social strata informs a lot of our outcomes. It doesn't mean that we're chained to it, but the links are there. And we have to ask again, well, is this really causing this? Or does this group of people just have more time to cook healthy meals, for example, and therefore have higher life expectancy, or whatever we're talking about? And that was a theme for me. And I wonder, how do you, as someone who is communicating science and trying to communicate the actual things that are going on rather than what we wish them to be, how do you cut through the noise when it comes to social inequality, or these causations that are actually just very deeply rooted and may actually be economic in nature, and therefore political or socio-political in nature?
Well, so much there. We could do an hour on this topic. First of all, I think we need less people that look like me out there. I think we need to have a diversity of voices, and I think we're starting to see that more often. And we want to make that a value of science up first. By the way, we're creating this value document, and that's going to be one of them. Secondly, I also think that what we need to do is constantly reinforce the role of socioeconomics, and the role of systemic issues in health, and not back away from it. And unfortunately, so often the biomedical research framework focuses on these interventions that ignore the broader public health concerns. Now, I actually hope, Ben, we're getting pretty deep here at the end of our time together.
That's the way I like it.
I actually think, and I'm actually hopeful. I always like to be a positive, glass half full kind of individual, that I hope that one of the legacies of the pandemic is exactly what we're talking about: a greater recognition of the role of equity issues, a greater recognition of the role of diversity issues, a greater recognition of the role of these big public health relevant initiatives to not just our health, but our well-being. And I'm sensing that, and I work very closely with the biomedical research community, and I am sensing that. So this is a good news story, that, a silver lining to what we've all experienced over the last 18 months, this greater recognition, also in the context of messaging, right, about tackling misinformation and about tackling, fake news and all this. I think there's a greater recognition of all of these broader systemic issues. And now let's hope it's maintained. It's not going to be easy, right? It's not going to be easy, but I'm seeing some signaling pointing in the right direction.
Tim, we got a couple more questions in the chat. I think we'll be able to get to both of them. From Chris Everdell, he says, your passion for science is very evident. So thank you, Chris. I really appreciate that comment. And no, obviously that was for you, Tim. And then he asks, how would you define evidence?
Yeah, so this is a really, again, this is a conversation, it could be an hour long. I think that I'm going to use this question as an opportunity to talk about science as a process. I think that when we talk about what evidence is, it's using science, the process of science, to objectively paint a picture of our world, right? And you could use a variety of methods to do that. Some of them are more robust than others. But now, one of the reasons that this is so important is that so often evidence is portrayed as a list of facts. And if one of those facts is wrong, science is wrong. And that, of course, isn't the case at all. Science is a constantly evolving, self-correcting process. The other thing that I think is really important here, and it's sort of made my life easier, and again, I've been battling this for decades, is that increasingly unproven therapies are represented as if they are science-based. So when I first started fighting this cause, there was interesting questions about, well, what if it's a spiritual approach to health? Or what if there's this other sort of way of knowing that is supporting this? That's an interesting question philosophically and from a health policy perspective, and kind of complex, right? But increasingly what's happened is that people don't do that anymore. What they say is this is science-based, this is evidence-based, and then they refer to quantum physics or they refer to something else to support their claim. And so when they do that, it's entirely justified to use science to critique those claims. You follow what I'm saying? And we've actually studied this, you guys. This is, I'm not just speculating. We've studied this shift. So increasingly, people are representing things as if it's science-based, whether you're talking about Reiki or whether you're talking about homeopathy or whether you're talking about supplements or whether you're talking about, you can go on and on and on. It's being represented as if it's rooted in science. And when you do that, fair to critique it on the principles of science.
Tim, this is actually something I really appreciate about your approach, both in your writing, but also in your documentary TV series, A User's Guide to Cheating Death, which is a really fascinating, but also quite funny show, where you actually approach a lot of these people who propose their own therapies, whether it's, sleep therapy or meditation, whether it's spiritual or calling themselves science when it's not actually, like Deepak Chopra, who's saying that just become the neutron or whatever he says. But essentially using science to couch your non-scientific methodologies. But what I really appreciate that you do is you actually give them the benefit of the doubt in person and really try these things out. And one thing that you've said in another conversation is that at no point was it ever a negative, or rarely is it a negative experience. Right. Always a really positive, helpful, and maybe even healthy experience to visit an acupuncturist, for example. So there is something there, and it doesn't mean it's beyond science or super science, but just that sometimes personal connection is really meaningful. And I guess I wanted to say I appreciate that, and I think your readers do too.
Thank you for that. You're right, and we also try not to make fun of. It's always important to listen to people. What are they getting out of this? Hey, I got to meditate in an ancient Kyoto temple with a monk. Yeah, how do you measure this from a scientific perspective? The benefits of that, right, Ben? It was just an amazing experience.
Totally. Tim, this is the last question. We don't have a lot of time, but I found this one pretty funny. Your book is called Relax, and you are such a vibrant presenter. How do you actually follow your own advice, and how?
It was funny. Is that my wife's question?
Michelle asks this question.
I really do try to follow my own advice. So I try to put my phone to bed at 9 o'clock. I try to exercise, and right after this, Ben, I'm going to go for a walk so I can walk the talk to try to relax myself. So I do try. I don't always succeed. I can tell you that right now. I don't always succeed, but I try, right? That's all we can do.
Well, and I think that's a theme that comes out in your book a lot too, is that there's only so much time and energy that we have. We're obviously not all researchers like you, and even you are in a position where it's difficult sometimes to live up to what you like, going for a walk every day, putting your phone to bed, not being such a germaphobe, which is something. But yeah, Tim, this has been a really, really enlightening and fascinating conversation that is such a great supplement to your book, which I couldn't recommend enough. It was really eye-opening and powerful for me to read. And I think that others who pick it up will feel the same. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for the opportunity to be here. Really, really do appreciate it. Thanks a lot, you guys.
Era, I'm just going to pass it over to you to close us out.
All right. Well, just to add on to the many thanks, this was such a great and informative conversation and so timely for the situation that we find ourselves in now. So I wanted to thank Timothy and Ben for coming to us from various parts of Canada to entertain and inform us as we have our dinners today. Thank you to Penguin Random House Canada and to Novel Idea. A reminder that Timothy's book is out now, and it's called Relax, Dammit. There's your cups of coffee right there on the front
That's
cover.
right. Cheers.
I also just want to let people know that we do have another pre-festival event coming up on Tuesday, April 27th, and that's with local author Wayne Grady and Lawrence Scanlon. And Wayne has a new novel out. It's his first ever contemporary novel, and I just got copies of the books today, so that's very exciting. So hope you can join us for that. And once again, Ben, Timothy, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for supporting this event, and hope everyone has a wonderful weekend. Stay safe and stay well.